The morning mist hung low over the Quantico training facility as Sarah Martinez pulled into the nearly empty parking lot. At 34, she had learned to appreciate the quiet hours before dawn when the world seemed to belong only to those dedicated enough to claim it. Her beat-up Honda Civic looked out of place among the few government vehicles scattered across the asphalt. But Sarah had never been one to draw attention to herself. She grabbed her worn gym bag from the passenger seat, the same bag she had carried for the past 8 years. Inside were her carefully maintained gear, and the kind of equipment that most people would never need to touch in their entire lives. Sarah had gotten used to the weight of it, both physical and metaphorical. The security guard at the gate barely looked up from his newspaper as she flashed her civilian contractor badge. Thomas had been working the early shift for 3 years now, and he had grown accustomed to Sarah's routine. She arrived every Tuesday and Thursday at 0500 hours sharp, stayed for exactly 2 hours, and left without saying much more than a polite good morning. Sarah made her way through the familiar corridors of the training complex. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the institutional gray walls. Her footsteps echoed softly on the polished concrete floor as she passed empty offices and darkened classrooms. The building felt different in these early hours, almost peaceful compared to the chaos that would fill it once the regular training schedules began. The indoor shooting range was her destination, a place where she could practice without curious eyes and unwanted questions. Sarah had discovered early in her transition to civilian life that her skills were both a blessing and a burden. They kept her sharp and focused, but they also set her apart in ways that made normal relationships complicated. She entered the range control room and signed the logbook with practiced efficiency. The range safety officer, a retired Marine named Rodriguez, nodded at her from behind his coffee cup. He had stopped asking questions about her background years ago, recognizing something in her bearing that spoke of experience beyond what most civilians possessed. Sarah selected lane 15, the one furthest from the entrance, and partially hidden by a support column. She preferred the isolation it provided, allowing her to work through her routines without the distraction of curious observers. The range was equipped with state-of-the-art electronic targets that could be programmed for various scenarios, but Sarah usually kept things simple. Her equipment setup was methodical and precise. She laid out her gear on the bench in a specific order that had become second nature over the years. First came her shooting glasses and hearing protection, followed by her ammunition, carefully sorted by type and purpose. Her primary weapon emerged from its case like an old friend greeting her after a long absence. The Heckler & Koch 416 assault rifle had been modified according to her exact specifications. Most civilians would never have access to such a weapon, but Sarah's contractor status provided certain privileges that came with her consulting work for various government agencies. The rifle felt natural in her hands, its weight and balance as familiar as her own heartbeat. Sarah began with basic drills, movements that might have looked routine to an untrained observer, but were actually complex sequences designed to maintain muscle memory and reaction speed. She worked through magazine changes, transitioning between targets, and various shooting positions with fluid grace that spoke of thousands of hours of practice. Her breathing was controlled and rhythmic as she engaged targets at different distances. The electronic scoring system recorded each shot with mechanical precision. But Sarah barely glanced at the numbers. She could feel when a shot was perfect, could sense the minute differences that separated good shooting from exceptional marksmanship. As the morning progressed, Sarah gradually increased the difficulty of her exercises. She began incorporating movement, using the range's limited space to practice scenarios that required shooting while advancing or retreating. Her movements were economical and purposeful, each step calculated to maintain stability while keeping her weapon ready. The sound of gunfire echoed through the facility, a rhythmic percussion that marked the passage of time. Sarah lost herself in the familiar routine, allowing her mind to focus entirely on the immediate demands of each drill. This was her meditation, her way of maintaining the connection to skills that had once defined her entire existence. Other shooters began arriving as the morning wore on. Sarah was aware of their presence, but didn't let it distract her from her work. She had learned to tune out the background noise of conversation and equipment being handled by less experienced hands. Her focus remained laser-sharp on her own performance. Some of the newer arrivals watched her with curious interest. There was something about the way she handled her weapon, and moved through her drills that marked her as different from the typical recreational shooter. But Sarah had perfected the art of seeming approachable, while maintaining just enough distance to discourage casual conversation. A group of young military recruits entered the range with their instructor, a grizzled sergeant who looked like he had seen more than his share of combat. They were fresh-faced and eager, still new enough to their training that everything seemed exciting and important. Sarah remembered what it felt like to have that kind of enthusiasm for the military life. The recruits set up at the opposite end of the range, their instructor guiding them through basic rifle marksmanship principles. Their shots were inconsistent, and their movements lacked the smooth coordination that came with experience. It was clear they were still learning the fundamentals that Sarah had mastered long ago. Sarah continued her own training, working through a complex drill that involved engaging multiple targets in a specific sequence, while managing ammunition conservation. To most observers, it would have looked like simple target shooting. But the underlying complexity of the exercise revealed itself in the precision of her movements and the consistency of her results. The morning session was drawing to a close when Sarah noticed one of the recruits had been watching her more intently than the others. He was a young man with sharp eyes and an alert expression that suggested he might be more observant than his peers. When their eyes met briefly, he quickly looked away and returned his attention to his own shooting. Sarah began her equipment breakdown routine, cleaning and securing her weapons with the same methodical care she had shown during setup. Every piece of gear was inspected, cleaned, and returned to its proper place in her bag. It was a ritual that provided closure to her training session and helped her transition back to the mundane world outside the range. As she prepared to leave, Sarah noticed the young recruit was still stealing glances in her direction. There was something in his expression that made her slightly uncomfortable, a look of recognition that seemed out of place. She told herself it was probably just curiosity about her equipment or shooting ability, but years of experience had taught her to trust her instincts when something felt off. The recruit whispered something to one of his companions, who then looked in Sarah's direction with the same intense expression. Whatever was being discussed, it clearly had something to do with her, and Sarah felt a familiar tension beginning to build in her shoulders. She finished packing her gear and headed toward the exit, maintaining her usual calm demeanor while internally preparing for whatever might be coming. The recruit's behavior had triggered old instincts that she had hoped to leave buried in her past. But some things never truly went away. Sarah had made it halfway to the parking lot when she heard footsteps behind her. The sound was measured and deliberate, not the casual pace of someone heading to their car. She adjusted her grip on her equipment bag and continued walking, using the reflective surface of a parked vehicle to observe whoever was following her. The young recruit from the shooting range was approaching with careful steps, his expression a mixture of uncertainty and determination. He appeared to be alone, which was both reassuring and puzzling. Sarah had dealt with enough situations to know that most people didn't approach strangers in parking lots unless they had something specific in mind. She stopped walking and turned to face him, keeping her posture relaxed but ready. Years of training had taught her to read body language and assess threats quickly. And this young man didn't seem hostile. If anything, he appeared nervous, like someone gathering courage for a difficult conversation. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, stopping about 10 feet away with his hands visible. His voice carried a slight southern accent and the respectful tone that military training instilled in recruits. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I was wondering if I could ask you something." Sarah studied his face for a moment before responding. He was younger than she had initially thought, probably no more than 22, with the kind of earnest expression that hadn't been worn down by years of military service yet. His uniform was crisp and properly maintained, suggesting he took his training seriously. "What can I do for you?" Sarah asked, her voice neutral but not unfriendly. She had learned to maintain a balance between approachability and caution that served her well in uncertain situations. The recruit glanced around the parking lot as if making sure they wouldn't be overheard, then took a small step closer. "My name is Private Jackson, ma'am. I've been watching you shoot this morning, and I have to ask, have we met before? You seem really familiar." The question sent a small chill down Sarah's spine. This was exactly the kind of situation she had been trying to avoid by maintaining a low profile and keeping her training sessions private. Recognition could lead to uncomfortable questions and unwanted attention from people who might remember her from a different life. I don't think so, Sarah replied carefully. I'm just a civilian contractor who comes here to practice sometimes. Nothing special about that. Private Jackson's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by her response. He shifted his weight slightly and seemed to be wrestling with whether to pursue the conversation further. It's just that, he began, then paused as if reconsidering his words. The way you handle your weapon. The drills you were running. It looked really professional, like more than just recreational shooting or basic contractor training. Sarah felt her pulse quicken slightly, but she kept her expression neutral. This recruit was more observant than she had given him credit for, and his questions were heading in directions that could become problematic if she wasn't careful. I take my training seriously, she said with a slight shrug. When you're working in environments where your life might depend on your skills, it pays to stay sharp. The young man nodded slowly, but the look in his eyes suggested he was processing more than just her words. There was an intelligence there that made Sarah reassess her initial impression of him as just another eager recruit. What kind of contractor work do you do? Jackson asked. And the question felt less like casual curiosity and more like a deliberate probe for information. Sarah considered her options. She could provide a vague answer and try to end the conversation, or she could give him enough detail to satisfy his curiosity without revealing anything sensitive. Both approaches carried risks, but deflecting too obviously might only increase his suspicions. Security consulting, she said after a moment. Risk assessment, personnel protection planning, that sort of thing. It requires maintaining certain skill sets that I developed earlier in my career. Jackson nodded again, but his expression remained thoughtful. Earlier career. Would that have been military? The question was direct enough that Sarah realized this conversation was heading somewhere specific. This wasn't random curiosity from a recruit impressed by good shooting. Jackson was fishing for something particular, which meant he either suspected something about her identity or had recognized something that triggered a memory. Some people might call it that, Sarah replied carefully, neither confirming nor denying his assumption. A lot of contractors have military backgrounds. It's pretty common in this line of work. Private Jackson was quiet for several seconds, his gaze fixed on her face as if trying to solve a puzzle. When he spoke again, his voice was lower and more serious than before. Ma'am, I don't want to be disrespectful, but I have to ask you something directly. Were you ever involved in special operations? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow, even though she had been expecting something like it. Special operations was a small community, and people who had served in that world often recognized each other through subtle signs that civilians would never notice. Jackson's question suggested he had either served in that community himself or had enough exposure to it to recognize the markers. That's a very specific question, Sarah said, buying time to think. What makes you ask something like that? Jackson looked around the parking lot again, then took another step closer. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because I've seen those exact movement patterns before, ma'am. The way you cleared corners in the range, the specific sequence of your target engagement drill, the way you maintained situational awareness while handling your weapon. I've only seen that level of precision from one unit. Sarah felt her mouth go dry. If Jackson had recognized her movement patterns, it meant he had been exposed to training or operations that very few people outside the special operations community would ever see. That narrowed down the possibilities of who he might be and why he would have such knowledge considerably. You're making some pretty big assumptions based on watching someone shoot, Sarah said. But her voice lacked conviction, and they both knew it. Jackson's expression grew more serious. Ma'am, my older brother served with the 75th Ranger Regiment before he was selected for special operations. He used to tell me stories about the training and the people he worked with. Some of those stories included descriptions of operators who were different from the typical soldier. The conversation was moving into dangerous territory now. Sarah realized that Jackson wasn't just making random observations about her shooting skills. He was connecting specific dots that suggested knowledge of operations and personnel that should have been classified far above his clearance level. Your brother told you about classified operations? Sarah asked, her tone sharpening slightly. Not classified details, Jackson said quickly. But he did mention working with some operators who were so skilled they seemed almost legendary. He described one in particular. Jackson paused, seeming to gather courage for what he was about to say. A female operator who was known for being able to complete missions that other teams couldn't even attempt. Sarah's blood ran cold. There were very few female operators in the special operations community, and even fewer who had achieved the kind of reputation that would make them memorable enough for soldiers to tell stories about. If Jackson's brother had served in units that worked alongside her former team, there was a real possibility that he had heard descriptions that could identify her. There are female operators in several units, Sarah said carefully. That's not exactly a unique description. Jackson looked directly into her eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice carried absolute certainty. Ma'am, my brother described an operator who could engage 12 targets in under 10 seconds with perfect accuracy while moving through a building. Someone who could complete solo infiltrations that required skills most people couldn't learn in a lifetime of training. The specific details he mentioned were too accurate to be coincidental. Sarah realized that Jackson wasn't guessing about her identity anymore. He was testing whether she would admit to something he already believed to be true. That sounds like quite a story, Sarah said. But her response felt hollow even to herself. Private Jackson stood straighter and looked at her with an expression that was part awe and part respect. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet but clear. Ma'am, I think you might be someone my brother called Ghost. The name hit Sarah like a sledgehammer to the chest. She had not heard that call sign spoken aloud in over 3 years, and hearing it now in a parking lot from a young recruit felt surreal and dangerous at the same time. Ghost was a name from another life. A life she had deliberately left behind when she transitioned to civilian work. Sarah studied Jackson's face intently, looking for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. What she saw instead was genuine respect mixed with curiosity. The expression of someone who had just solved a puzzle that had been bothering him. The young man clearly had no idea of the implications of what he had just said. Ghost is a common enough call sign, Sarah said slowly, testing how much he actually knew. Lots of operators have used that one over the years. Jackson shook his head firmly. Not like this, ma'am. My brother David served with the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta for 4 years before he was recruited for something even more classified. He told me about working with an operator who was so effective at solo infiltration and elimination that other soldiers started calling her the Ghost because she could get in and out of hostile territory without anyone knowing she had been there. The level of detail Jackson was providing made Sarah's pulse quicken. Delta Force recruitment for even more classified operations could only mean one thing. His brother had been selected for the same unit that Sarah had served with before her transition to civilian life. The unit that officially didn't exist, and whose operations were buried so deep in classification that most military personnel would never know about them. Your brother David, Sarah said carefully. What's his last name? Jackson, ma'am. Staff Sergeant David Jackson. He's been deployed for the past 18 months on operations he can't tell me about. But before he left, he mentioned working with the most skilled female operator he had ever seen. Sarah's memory clicked into place with sudden clarity. David Jackson had been part of the support team for her final mission, a deep reconnaissance operation in Eastern Europe that had required her to spend 6 weeks behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence on weapons trafficking networks. He had been responsible for communications and extraction coordination, and she remembered him as competent and reliable. The realization that she was talking to David Jackson's younger brother created a complicated emotional response. David had been one of the few people who had understood the personal cost of the work she did, and they had developed a professional respect that bordered on friendship. If David had shared stories about her with his family, it suggested a level of trust that she had not expected. If David is your brother, Sarah said slowly, then you should understand that some conversations shouldn't happen in parking lots. Jackson's expression immediately became more serious. Yes, ma'am. I understand operational security, but I also understand that if you really are who I think you are, then I'm talking to someone who has done things for our country that most people will never know about. The respect in his voice was genuine, but Sarah could also hear the curiosity of someone who had grown up hearing stories about legendary operators and was now faced with the possibility of meeting one in person. She realized that this conversation could go in several different directions, and not all of them would end well. "What exactly did your brother tell you?" Sarah asked, deciding that understanding the scope of Jackson's knowledge was more important than maintaining her cover story. Jackson looked around the parking lot once more, then moved closer so they could speak in lower voices. "He told me that there was an operator codenamed Ghost, who could complete missions that required skills beyond normal special operations training. Someone who could infiltrate hostile territory alone, gather intelligence that other teams couldn't obtain, and eliminate high-value targets without leaving evidence behind." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The description was accurate enough that there could be no doubt about what unit David Jackson had been referring to. The operations Jackson was describing were the kind that left no official records and were never acknowledged by any government agency. He also said, Jackson continued, that Ghost was a woman who had sacrificed everything for her country, including her identity and any chance at a normal life. David told me that she was the most dedicated soldier he had ever worked with, but also the loneliest person he had ever met. The personal nature of that observation hit Sarah harder than the operational details. David had seen through her professional facade to the isolation that came with living a life where maintaining cover stories was more important than maintaining relationships. The fact that he had shared that insight with his brother suggested that he had understood her situation better than she had realized. "Your brother sounds like he was a good soldier," Sarah said quietly. "But he also sounds like he shared information that should have stayed classified." Jackson shook his head quickly. "He never gave me operational details or anything that could compromise security. He worried about the people he worked with, especially the ones who didn't have anyone to worry about them." The statement carried an emotional weight that made Sarah's throat tighten. During her years of active service, she had convinced herself that isolation was necessary for operational security and mission effectiveness. The idea that David Jackson had been concerned about her personal well-being was both touching and disturbing. "What happened to your brother after that last deployment you mentioned?" Sarah asked, realizing that she needed to understand more about David's current situation. Jackson's expression darkened slightly. "That's part of why I recognized you, ma'am. David was killed 4 months ago on a classified operation. The military told our family that he died serving his country with distinction. But they couldn't tell us any details about what happened or where." Sarah felt the world shift around her. David Jackson had been a good man and a skilled operator, someone who deserved better than dying anonymously on a mission that would never be acknowledged. His death also meant that someone who had known about her identity and background was gone, leaving his brother as potentially the only person outside official channels who could connect her to her former life. "I'm sorry for your loss," Sarah said, and the words carried genuine emotion. David was one of the good ones. Jackson's eyes widened at her use of the past tense. "You did know him. You really are Ghost." Sarah looked at the young man standing before her and made a decision that went against years of training and security protocols. Jackson had lost his brother to the same world that had consumed most of her adult life, and he deserved some measure of truth about the man David had been. "Your brother was part of my support team on my final mission," Sarah said quietly. "He was professional, reliable, and brave. He also understood that the work we did came with costs that most people couldn't imagine." Jackson nodded slowly, processing the confirmation of what he had suspected. David used to say that the real heroes were the ones whose names would never be on any memorial wall, whose families would never know what they had accomplished. "He was right about that," Sarah replied. "And he was one of those heroes himself." They stood in silence for several moments, both reflecting on the implications of their conversation. Sarah realized that her carefully constructed civilian life had just become more complicated, but she also felt a strange sense of relief at being able to acknowledge her past with someone who understood its significance. "What happens now?" Jackson asked eventually. I'm not going to tell anyone about this conversation, but I want you to know that meeting you, it helps me understand why David was so proud of the work he did." Sarah considered her options. She could try to minimize the situation and hope that Jackson would keep their conversation to himself. Or she could take a more direct approach to ensuring operational security. Neither option felt completely satisfactory. "What happens now?" Sarah said finally. is that you finish your training, serve your country with the same dedication your brother showed, and remember that some stories are too important to tell." Jackson straightened and nodded with understanding. "Yes, ma'am. And if there's ever anything I can do to honor David's memory or support someone who served with him, just be the kind of soldier he would have been proud to call his brother," Sarah replied. "That's all any of us can do." As Jackson walked back toward the training facility, Sarah stood alone in the parking lot, reflecting on how quickly her quiet morning routine had been disrupted by an encounter with the past. The conversation had reminded her that the work she had done still mattered to people, even if it could never be publicly acknowledged. She got into her Honda Civic and drove toward the exit, knowing that her Tuesday and Thursday morning routine would continue as before. But something fundamental had changed in those few minutes of conversation. For the first time in years, someone had recognized not just her skills, but the sacrifices that had come with developing them. As she passed the security gate, Thomas looked up from his newspaper and gave her the same casual wave he had offered every week for 3 years. Sarah waved back, realizing that maintaining her cover story had just become both more important and more meaningful than it had been that morning. The quiet woman who practiced at the range twice a week would continue to be exactly that, but now she carried the knowledge that somewhere in the world, a young soldier understood the true cost of the freedom he was training to defend, and that his understanding had been shaped in part by the memory of someone who had paid that cost willingly. Ghost Recon had officially never existed, but its legacy lived on in the dedication of soldiers like David Jackson, and the quiet morning routines of operators like Sarah Martinez, who continued to honor their training long after their official service had ended.